Please be seated. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
So, how are you, goes the question. The answer is supposed to be good or great, or sometimes in business even awesome. It's not really an honest question. In fact, an honest answer that talks about personal problems or family issues or lingering grief is likely to make the hearer smile a little bigger as they start to slowly inch away from you. Our social contract is that we all say we're good, or at the very least, okay, and then move on to whether it has any bearing on what our actual lives look like or not. Now, I noticed that this started to break down during the pandemic. On a Zoom call, I asked a colleague how she was doing, and she answered, COVID okay. The baseline amount of pain, fear, and trauma in our society was too great to maintain the false pretense that everything was really okay. Not even this most basic of our social conventions could withstand the level of psychological assault our entire society was undergoing. And not without reason. The USA lost over 1 million people in the pandemic by conservative estimates. Our society had not experienced anything like this since the 1914 flu epidemic, and historians are only just now beginning to understand how deeply the 1914 epidemic affected us. We really have no idea right now how all of the accumulated trauma from the last 2 years will change us. And here in Waukesha, we have our own specific trauma. 6 killed and 62 injured in the attack on our Christmas parade last year, just a couple of blocks down the street. We mourned the dead and raised money to help the living, but all of us, our entire city, our entire county, have experienced a traumatic event that we should expect to influence us for at least a generation. No, beloved, we are not okay. We are broken. And no amount of smiling, flag-waving, or protestations that we really are fine will change that. We've all been hurt deeply, and the social convention of insisting that nothing is wrong rings hollow and untrue. This way of burying unpleasantness that is such a part of American life becomes less and less effective all the time. Therapist and former Baptist pastor Eric Minton writes that our society wrongly teaches us that our pain and confusion in the face of what passes for modern life are a sign of weakness and will eventually wreck our futures. As someone who works with a lot of teenagers experiencing record levels of depression, he asks the question nobody seems to be asking: are the kids really wrong? Or are they depressed because they really are facing a world that is worth being depressed about? Yet we continue to try to force them to cheer up because we are terrified about what the future holds for them if they don't. We continue to try to make them act normal, even though acting normal in the fact of such challenges might actually be insane. We equate a positive attitude with survival and success. But what if we're missing something here? What if the manic insistence on positivity our culture is selling is not only false advertising, but a toxic product that will lead to nothing but further dysfunction and disease? In our first reading this morning, we hear the book of Lamentations. It's the only time in the 3-year lectionary cycle we read from this book. I suspect because it's a real downer. Indeed, the Hebrew name for this book is its first word, which translates as alas. The author laments over a depopulated Jerusalem. Alas, how she sits alone, the city once great with people, she has become like a widow, great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labor. Her babes have fallen captive before the foe. Scholars place the composition of this book after the Babylonian invasion of Judah, which occurred in 586 BC. The Babylonian armies swept aside resistance, razed the cities and the Jerusalem temple, and took all of the leaders and artisans back to Babylon in chains. The Babylonians' method was to enact a kind of cultural genocide that meant that cultures conquered by them simply did not survive. Much like the Borg in Star Trek, Conquered civilizations were to be assimilated, and resistance was futile. The people of Israel were the inheritors of the promise to Abraham. They had crossed the Red Sea on dry ground with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, protecting them. They believed they were a chosen people of God to be a light to the nations. How could this have possibly happened to them? Now, most civilizations conquered by the Babylonians simply gave up. They decided everything was fine with the new order they now lived in. They adopted Babylonian customs and the Babylonian gods wholesale. After all, their gods had been defeated. But not so with the people of Israel. They refused to pretend that things were okay. They lamented. Minton writes, "Grief is a guttural expression of faith in a world beyond the one we are living in now. If one says everything is okay, then one is accepting the world as it is. The ancient people of Israel refused to believe the world was as it should have been, that being slaves in Babylon was the ultimate plan that God had for them. They listened to their own grief and demanded an answer from God." Most scholars believe that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, as well as parts of the Psalms, were written during this time. Their culture was not destroyed. Indeed, when captivity ended, the Jewish people had a coherent identity they did not before. It's because they began with lament and allowed it to change them. Grief and anger can be transformative. Naming grief together allows us to slow down and examine exactly what we value. Brene Brown writes that anger is a catalyst. On one hand, holding on to it will make us sick. But on the other hand, it's an emotion that we can transform into something life-giving: courage, love, compassion, and justice. If we pass up these emotions because they're unpleasant, we miss the inherent opportunity that grief and anger bring to help us discern who we are and move into the future. Indeed, grief is a gift we have been given from God. True courage is not running from it, but allowing ourselves to sink in and to plumb its depths, and then arising from it when the time is right. Remember that much like the author of Lamentations, Jesus himself wept over Jerusalem. If God can weep, then so should we. A member of the congregation once said to me, "I am so sorry, I come to church, I cry all the way through church every Sunday." That is not a problem. That's an expression of faith, that we know somehow deep down within ourselves that things should be different. When we're confronted with the story of Jesus within this community of those that love him and are offered his body and blood given for us, how can we not feel that disconnect with what is going on in the world around us? How can we not grieve? Grief and hope are connected. We cannot hope for the future if we cannot feel that something is wrong with the present. The 14th century English mystic Julian of Norwich lived in one of the most difficult times in English history. During her life, she survived 3 waves of the Black Plague, though it's thought her family may have not. She saw civil war rage around her, and the church was rent into 2, and at one point 3 parts, as rival bishops all claimed to be the rightful pope. In the vision she received, Jesus tells her, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Now, people often cite that in a kind of Pollyannish way of thinking, as if this revelation is something equivalent to "don't worry, be happy." But that completely misses her point. Julian spends 20 years in between her revelation and the time she writes her longer text, struggling with the paradox between the suffering she sees around her and her rock-solid belief that all shall be well. She gets partial satisfaction from her reflections, but there is always a remaining tension for her. I tell people that a way to read her struggle more productively is, "All shall be well at the far end," but that doesn't mean things are not actually horrible right now. I often use more colorful language for that, but you know I'm in the pulpit today, so. There is an end that we are heading for, which is a place of love, compassion, and justice. Grief is the natural reaction when we're confronted with the reality that we are not there yet. We have hope. But if we fail to grieve and lament what is wrong, we're actually working against that hope. Beloved, we are not okay, but that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's where we should be in such a world. As we continue to suffer from the tail end effects of the pandemic, as we worry about war and conflict, as our society finds more and more ways to alienate us one from the other, we have to start with lament. The failure to do so is to refuse the method God has given us to change the world around us and to mold ourselves further to the image of God we are created in. Particularly, I want to mention the upcoming Brooks trial, which is scheduled to start tomorrow. We all long for justice. I myself have some very clear ideas about outcomes I would like to see, but we're all going to have to let the justice system do its work. This is going to be hard. It is going to be triggering. It will be heart-wrenching. It's going to re-traumatize our entire community, whether we were directly affected by the attack or not. We need to recognize that. Grief and anger will be natural outcomes of this trial. We will all feel it in one way or another. And my plea to you for the sake of your soul is, let it happen. Do not stop yourself from lamenting. If you find yourself crying without an explanation or in a really bad mood over the coming weeks, maybe it's this. That would be normal. That would be human. Hold on to the faith that in the end love wins, that all shall be well, but that does not mean everything is great right now. Hold on to each other because it is human connection to each other and our connection as a community to God that will sustain us. We are not okay, but that is okay. We can make it through together. Amen.